It started like any other journey. A man known for lighting up stadiums walking quietly through an airport with his wife by his side. But what unfolded next wasn't a routine trip. It was something darker, something uglier. And by the time it ended, it wasn't just a travel inconvenience. It was a moment that revealed just how easily dignity can be trampled in the name of procedure. The sky over London was a dull grey. Heathrow buzzed with its usual chaos, luggage wheels rattling, flight announcements echoing, travellers running on caffeine and impatience. Mohammed Salah had just landed with Maji, his wife. No red carpets, no entourage, just two people wrapped in coats and quiet purpose. They were en route to New York for a charity gala, a trip meant to support displaced refugee children. Nothing controversial, nothing newsworthy. Or so they thought. Despite his global fame, Salah moved like a man used to disappearing into crowds. The scarf around his neck, the way he kept his head down, the subtle glances he exchanged with Maji, all of it painted a picture of humility. Maji, graceful and calm in her black hijab, clutched a simple leather bag. Her expression was soft but alert. They weren't there to be seen. They were just passing through. A few fans noticed, sure. One or two even raised phones but didn't dare take the shot. Something about Salah's presence made people pause. There was a serenity to him, a quiet authority that didn't need noise. Then they reached security. And everything changed. A section of the terminal had been designated for a joint US-UK screening effort. Stricter checks, more aggressive procedures. Salah didn't think much of it. He'd travelled enough times to know the drill. Remove shoes. Place liquids in the tray, stay patient. But as soon as the officer saw them, the mood shifted. She was tall, broad-shouldered, with hair pulled so tight it seemed to lift her eyebrows permanently. Her badge glinted under the harsh lights. Her eyes locked onto Maji like a hawk zeroing in on prey. She leaned over to a colleague and muttered something. He looked, nodded, and that was the start of it. The metal detector line was moving, but the energy was off. Salah felt it, that tightening in his chest, the sudden awareness that they were no longer passengers. They were suspects. Not for what they'd done, but for how they looked, what they wore. When it was their turn, they followed protocol. Bags on the belt, shoes in the tray. Maji offered a small smile to the officer, who didn't return it. Instead, she pointed at her. "Step aside, please," she barked, loud enough for the people in line to stop mid-conversation. Salah immediately turned. "Is there a problem?" His voice was calm, but his eyes weren't. "Routine check," she snapped. "Please stay back." Maji was led to a separate section, not a room, not even behind a curtain, just a marked area with a rubber mat and retractable tape. It was public, brutally public. She stood tall, hands at her sides, saying nothing. The officer's questions came sharp and fast. "Where are you from? Where are you going? Why are you wearing that?" Maji answered each one with practiced grace. "Egypt, New York. It's called a hijab, and it's part of my faith." But the officer didn't nod, didn't acknowledge, didn't even pretend to respect the answers. Her pen tapped against a clipboard, as if Maji were a test she couldn't wait to fail. Salah stood a few feet away, arms crossed, eyes locked on his wife. A security guard blocked his path when he tried to step closer. "Please stay back, sir." Maji's voice didn't waver. She explained again, gently, that she could remove her hijab in private with a female officer. But the woman wasn't interested in discretion. "You'll do it here," she said. Loud, clear, cold. People in the queue turned. Phones started to rise. Someone whispered Salah's name. The whisper spread like a virus. This wasn't going to stay quiet. Still, Maji held firm. "I'm sorry," she said, "but I can't do that here." The officer took a step closer, face flushed now, voice louder. "If you don't comply, you'll be detained. Do you understand? You won't board the flight. You'll be escorted." "Hout!" Salah's fists clenched. He took another step forward. "She's cooperating. She's only asking for privacy." The woman turned to him and in front of everyone raised her voice further. "Sir, stay out of this or you'll be removed too." Now the air had changed. The queue had gone silent. Every eye was on them. Every phone was recording. And still, Maji didn't move. But then the officer said something no one expected. "Remove it or we take you to the back, and that won't be as friendly." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. And Maji knew in that moment she was being punished. Not for hiding something, but for refusing to be humiliated on their terms. There are moments in life when silence screams louder than words, and right then, as Maji stood surrounded by strangers and judgment, her silence was deafening. The officer didn't blink. She stood there, arms folded, lips tight, waiting, daring Maji to resist further. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was about power, about putting someone in their place. In her eyes, Maji wasn't a woman to respect. She was a box to be checked, a problem to be dealt with. Maji closed her eyes briefly, inhaled and whispered, "I'll remove it, but only in private." Her voice was calm, but the hurt beneath it was unmistakable. The officer smirked. "Then you're refusing to comply. Step aside. You're delaying other passengers." Salah had had enough. He stepped forward, no longer hiding the fire in his chest. "You're humiliating her. She has rights. You're not above them." The second officer moved again to block him, this time placing a hand on his chest. "Step back now," he said, almost apologetically, but with force. Around them, travelers were whispering louder now. Someone muttered, "Isn't that Mo Salah?" A woman gasped and pulled her phone higher, but Salah didn't care. His fame wasn't a shield, not here, not now. Inside the cordoned space, Maji stood her ground, but she could feel the weight of the moment, the stares, the murmurs, the phones. Her scarf suddenly felt like a spotlight, every thread pulling at her dignity. The officer pointed. "Last chance." Maji looked to her husband. He nodded, softly, painfully. Not to tell her what to do, but to say, "Whatever you decide, I'm—" "Here," she turned back. "I will not remove it here," she said, louder this time. The words echoed off the sterile walls. That's when the officer crossed a line. She reached forward. She didn't ask again. She reached for the scarf. Salah moved instantly. "Don't touch her," he shouted, his voice booming through the terminal. Chaos erupted. The second officer grabbed Salah's arm, trying to hold him back. Phones were now held high. Dozens of passengers were filming. One man dropped his coffee. A child started crying. The officer froze, hand inches from Maji's head. The silence that followed was worse than shouting. It was the silence of disbelief, of people watching a line being crossed in real time. A middle-aged man in a business suit stepped forward. "You can't do that," he said firmly. "You can't lay hands on her. That's assault." The officer snapped her head toward him. "Step back, sir." But it was too late. The crowd wasn't having it anymore. Another voice joined in. A woman with a thick Scottish accent. "She said she'd do it in private. Are you deaf or just cruel?" More murmurs. Then more voices. "Uncalled for. Let her be. This is disgusting." Now the officer looked around and realized she'd lost control. The power she thought she had evaporated under the heat of 100 cameras and a rising wave of moral outrage. A supervisor appeared finally, having been alerted by the sudden burst of attention. A man in a crisp navy suit and polished shoes. He strode over, eyes darting between the officers and the growing crowd. "What's going on here?" he demanded. The female officer straightened up. "Passenger is refusing to comply with standard identification." She asked for a private room. Salah interrupted, voice sharp. "And your officer reached for her hijab, in public, in front of everyone." The supervisor blinked. "Is this true?" he asked the officer. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. The phones had caught it all. The supervisor took a breath and turned to Maji. "Ma'am, we can take you to a private room immediately if you still consent to the screening." Maji nodded slowly. "Yes." He signaled to another female officer nearby, younger, wide-eyed, clearly nervous, and she gently led Maji away. Salah stood motionless, jaw clenched, still staring at the officer who started it all. She turned her back without a word. But the crowd didn't. A few passengers clapped quietly, then louder. Not a celebration, but solidarity. Maji had stood her ground, and the people had seen it. The woman with the Scottish accent stepped up to Salah. "You handled that with more grace than I ever could," she said. "She's a credit to every woman out there." Salah nodded, grateful but exhausted. 10 minutes later, Maji returned. Her hijab was back in place, her posture strong, despite the ordeal. She took Salah's hand, and they moved toward the gate. Together, the crowd parting to let them through. But the damage was done. The moment had happened, and thanks to those dozens of phones, it was already racing toward the internet, like a lit match in dry grass. Behind them, the officer stood frozen, at her post, not in command, not proud, just exposed, for all the world to see. And the world, it was already watching. By the time Salah and Maji reached the boarding gate, the terminal was buzzing like a kicked beehive. Conversations were no longer hushed. People were openly talking about what they'd just witnessed. It wasn't just shock. It was anger, sharp and spreading. A teenage boy in a Liverpool hoodie scrolled through his phone, already seeing the video pop up on Twitter with the caption, "Mo Salah's wife forced to remove hijab at Heathrow. Officer tries to grab it." Crowd steps in. The footage was barely a minute long, but it didn't need to be any longer. It showed everything. The refusal, the reach, the resistance, the eruption. Maji sat down quietly near the gate, adjusting her hijab with careful, deliberate fingers. Not because it was out of place, but because it was the only thing she could control in that moment. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, She just moved with the steady dignity of someone who's endured more than most will ever understand. Salah stood next to her, his phone lighting up in his pocket, vibrating with notifications. Messages, mentions, articles already forming. Someone from his club had sent a simple text. "Saw the video, do you need us to step in?" He didn't reply. Not yet. His mind was still back at the security checkpoint, replaying the moment when a stranger's hand came within inches of his wife's head. If he hadn't spoken up, if the crowd hadn't turned, he clenched his fists. A few seats away, a woman with silver hair leaned over. "Love," she said gently to Maji, "I just wanted to say, that shouldn't have happened. You were brave." Maji offered a soft smile, the kind that said, "Thank you, and I'm tired," all at once. Then came the sound, the familiar ding of an airport announcement. But this time, it wasn't about a gate change. It was the PR team. "Attention. Passengers in Terminal 5. We are aware of an incident that occurred during the security screening process earlier today. We are reviewing the matter to ensure all protocols are followed respectfully." That was it. That was the statement. No apology, no name, no acknowledgement of what really happened. Just vague corporate fog designed to make people move along. But people weren't moving on. A man in a beige trench coat scoffed loudly. "Reviewing the matter. I just watched a woman nearly get assaulted in front of a crowd." Another traveller, a woman holding a toddler, muttered, "Would they have done that if she were a nun?" Near the window, a group of university students began organizing something, scribbling words onto paper signs using airport receipts and pens borrowed from the W.H. Smith nearby. One sign read, "Hijab is not a threat." Another, "Dignity isn't optional." The mood had changed. This wasn't about Salah anymore, or even just Maji. It was about something bigger, something collective, something that had been quietly simmering in the background of too many lives for too long. Across the world, the ripple was already becoming a wave. In Egypt, a popular sports journalist tweeted, "Mo Salah once again shows the world how to lead, not just on the field but in life. His wife's grace, his calm, their strength, may we all learn." In the US, a viral post read, "If this can happen to the wife of one of the world's most famous athletes, what happens to the rest of us when no one's watching?" Back in the terminal, a young staffer from the airline cautiously approached. She looked nervous, barely older than 20, holding a tray with 2 bottles of water. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry," she said, placing them down gently. "On behalf of, well, not them, but people who care." Salah nodded, grateful, and then came the voice that neither of them expected. "Mr. Salah?" They turned. It was the male officer from before, the one who had blocked Salah's path. But his posture was different now. No clipboard, no authority. Just a man who looked like he hadn't blinked in 5 minutes. "I'm sorry," he said. "What happened, that wasn't right. I should have spoken up. I didn't know how to react." Salah's response was slow, deliberate. You could have said something, you still can. The man looked down, ashamed. You're right. I just froze. I've seen things before, but not like that, not someone reaching. Maji's voice was calm. And next time, don't freeze. He nodded, swallowed, and stepped away. As they finally boarded the plane, heads low but hearts heavy, Salah's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't from a journalist or teammate. It was a message from a woman he didn't know. Just a screenshot of her 14-year-old daughter wearing a hijab with the caption, "She said she was scared to wear it to school. Not anymore." The plane doors closed and the world kept watching. As the wheels lifted off the runway and the plane banked over the grey skyline of London, Salah finally exhaled. Not because the situation was behind them, it wasn't, but because, for a few hours at least, they were in the air, unreachable. No security guards, no confrontations, just the muffled hum of engines and the quiet of a cabin where people either slept or stared out the window, pretending not to be thinking too much. Maji leaned her head against the seat and closed her eyes. Her hijab slightly loosened from earlier. She hadn't spoken much since the gate. Her silence wasn't cold. It was protective, like someone trying to stitch themselves back together in real time. Salah sat beside her, scrolling through his phone. Airplane Wi-Fi was patchy, but it didn't need to be fast. The notifications came in by the dozen. The video had exploded, millions of views in under 2 hours, not just from sports accounts or British news outlets, but global platforms. CNN, Al Jazeera, BBC, France 24. Everyone was running with it. Every thumbnail was the same. A still frame of Maji standing, proud and unflinching, while the officer's arm reached toward her, frozen in time, immortalized without her consent. Headlines blared. The comment sections were on fire. Some were supportive, thousands of people praising Maji's composure, Salah's restraint, the bystanders who stepped in. But others were venomous, revealing just how far humanity still had to go. Rules are rules. She should have just taken it off. They're probably hiding something. Salah didn't respond, but he read every word. Maji opened her eyes slightly and caught the screen. "Don't read the comments," she whispered. He gave a weak smile. I stopped at the 300. Still too many. He slid the phone into his jacket and reached for her hand. She took it without a word, letting her head rest on his shoulder. Somewhere in the middle of the flight, a flight attendant approached. She was in her mid-40s, gentle eyes, and a tone that didn't match the usual robotic professionalism. "Mr. Salah, Mrs. Salah, I just wanted to say, what happened to you was unacceptable. If you need anything, just let us know. We're all with you." Maji nodded politely. "Thank you." The attendant paused. "I wear a cross under my uniform," she said, tapping her chest lightly. "No one's ever asked me to take it off." And then she walked away. Back on the ground, Heathrow was scrambling. The footage had gone far beyond their control. Their earlier statement was being ripped to shreds online. Too vague, too corporate, too late. Pressure mounted. Civil liberties. Organizations began weighing in. Faith groups demanded accountability. The Muslim Council of Britain issued a sharp statement. Prominent athletes, journalists, and even celebrities who had never commented on religion were now speaking out. But perhaps most surprising of all were the everyday voices. A train conductor from Birmingham posted a video in his uniform saying, "I've worked in security, I've done screenings. That wasn't protocol, that was profiling, there's a difference." A schoolgirl in Bristol uploaded a TikTok, just her standing silently in a hijab, holding a sign that read, "I am not a threat." And a retired British soldier recorded a message from his garden. "I didn't fight for this country, so women could be humiliated for their beliefs at the airport. We're better than that." Salah watched each one from his seat, eyes heavy, but heart stirred. It wasn't about virality anymore, it was about visibility. Near the end of the flight, Maji finally broke her silence. She turned toward him and asked softly, "Do you think they'll actually do something about it?" Salah thought for a moment, then shrugged. "Maybe, maybe not. But it's out there now, and the world saw it." She nodded. "I just didn't want it to be like this." "I know," he replied. "Neither did I." When the plane touched down, in New York, they were met not by cameras or media, but by a quiet, respectful welcome from the airline staff. A representative offered to escort them through customs. Salah politely declined. They didn't want special treatment. They just wanted to be treated like people. As they walked through JFK, there were glances, a few whispered words, but no one approached. Not until they reached the baggage claim, where a middle-aged man in a janitor's uniform quietly passed them by and murmured, "Respect." Salah smiled. Maji whispered, "That's enough." They collected their bags, stepped into a black car waiting outside, and drove toward the hotel. The city skyline stretched out in front of them, glowing with the relentless energy only New York can carry. Neither of them spoke for a while, but in that silence, something else had started. A movement, a wave, and they were right at the center of it. Not because they asked to be, but because they stood still while the world tried to shake them. The hotel lobby in Manhattan was quiet, elegant and bathed in soft light. The kind of place where famous people could come and go unnoticed. But as Salah and Maji entered, even the concierge hesitated for a second. Not out of starstruck awe, but out of recognition. Not from the pitch, but from the news. A receptionist at the desk, no older than 25, straightened her jacket and offered a smile that seemed more nervous than professional. "Mr. and Mrs. Salah," she said gently, "we have everything prepared for you. If there's anything you need, just say the word." There was something in her tone that made it clear. She'd seen the video. They were checked in quickly and taken to a suite on the 18th floor, spacious, modern, and quiet. As the door shut behind them, the city buzzed faintly outside, but inside it was still. Maji sat down on the edge of the bed and exhaled, not from exhaustion that had come earlier, but from emotional weight. "I feel like I haven't breathed since London," she whispered. Salah poured her a glass of water and handed it over. "Then breathe now. You're safe." But he knew that safety at this point was more about emotion than environment. Because back home, and now all over the world, the incident wasn't dying down. It was erupting into something bigger than either of them had imagined. On Twitter, a video compilation was trending. Clips of women from different backgrounds putting on their hijabs, captioned, "We stand with Maji." It had been viewed over 6 million times in a day. Instagram was flooded with stories, tags, photos, teenage girls, old women, Muslim and non-Muslim alike, wearing headscarves in solidarity. A hashtag was now trending globally. Don Her Dignity Matters, Salah's inbox was bursting, not from sponsors or managers, but from strangers. Messages came from everywhere: rural towns in America, cities across Europe, remote villages in the Middle East, stories, gratitude, pain. One message read, "I wear a hijab in a small town in Canada. Every day feels like a challenge, but today I didn't feel alone." Another, "I'm a Christian, but after watching what your wife went through, I wore a scarf to church today. People stared. Now I know what it feels like." Maji read them silently. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. Sometimes she responded. Sometimes she couldn't. The weight of their words was too much. And then came the photos. Photos of schoolgirls in Liverpool standing in a line, all wearing hijabs. Their teacher had made it a class discussion. One girl held a sign that read, "We are all Maji today." Salah sat down beside her. "This is going to be bigger than we thought." Maji looked at him, the lines around her eyes deeper than yesterday. "But will it last?" she asked. "Or will it be like everything else, noise, then silence?" He didn't have an answer, but somewhere else the story was becoming more than just a viral moment. In London, civil rights lawyers held a press conference calling for a full inquiry into Heathrow's screening procedures. One of them, a former barrister turned MP, declared, "What happened to Mrs. Salah is not an isolated incident. It's a mirror, and this country has to look into it." A protest was scheduled for the weekend. Not violent, not angry, just deliberate, peaceful, powerful. Already thousands had RSVP'd online. They planned to march to the airport with signs that said things like, "My faith, my choice," and respect before regulation. At Heathrow, internal panic had set in. The officer involved had been placed on temporary suspension. The press office scrambled to find the right words. but none of them landed. Every sentence sounded hollow, compared to the simple, quiet strength of Maji standing still. Later that evening, Salah and Maji were invited to a private dinner with the charity hosting the gala. They declined the press events, but agreed to speak with a few key guests. The host greeted them warmly. No cameras, no questions, just people who care. At the dinner table, a Jewish rabbi from Brooklyn leaned forward and said, "What happened to your wife was not just religious discrimination. It was a failure of basic decency. And watching how you both responded, it gave people like me hope." A Sikh woman added, "I've worn a turban all my life. I've had similar encounters, but no one ever filmed it. No one ever spoke out. What you endured, it opened a door for all of us." Salah listened carefully. Maji nodded politely. But inside they were both carrying a question no one else could answer. How did a moment meant to strip someone of dignity become something that gave dignity back to others? As they returned to the hotel that night, Salah looked out at the New York skyline, a city built on noise, and found comfort in the quiet. But he knew the real noise was waiting. Because back in London, the newspapers had changed their tone, and tomorrow the headlines would hit harder. Morning broke in Manhattan with its usual symphony, car horns, distant sirens, voices echoing between buildings. But inside the quiet of the hotel room, the air felt heavier, not with dread, but with the weight of attention. Salah stood by the window, sipping coffee he hadn't touched. Maji was still lying in bed, half awake, scrolling through her phone in silence. The world hadn't moved on. If anything, it had doubled down. The UK front pages were ablaze. Columnists who had stayed quiet were now rushing to find their angle. Was this about racism, religious bias, gendered control? The nation had gone from pretending to not notice women like Maji to obsessing over them. But it wasn't just commentary now. It was consequences. The Prime Minister had been forced to address the matter in Parliament after an opposition MP asked directly, would the Prime Minister care to comment on how a British airport allowed a woman to be publicly humiliated for observing her faith, and how her husband's global fame is the only reason this wasn't swept under the rug? The chamber fell silent. The Prime Minister offered a guarded response. "We support religious freedom. We are investigating." It wasn't enough. Across town, the Home Secretary was grilled by the press. Is this what airport security in Britain stands for now? Finger-pointing and public humiliation of women in religious attire? A former TSA officer from the US even went viral with a blunt video. That wasn't protocol. That was prejudice dressed in uniform. Meanwhile, Heathrow's PR team was imploding. They released a longer statement that morning, full of corporate padding. "We regret the distress caused. We are reviewing policies. Training protocols will be reassessed." But it was too late. The footage, the expressions, the officers, hand in mid-air, it was all etched into the public's mind. Back in New York, Salah and Maji prepared for the charity gala. There was no stylist, no entourage, just the two of them. Maji wore deep green this time, elegant and bold. She adjusted the folds of her hijab in the mirror, her expression calm but her hands steady with purpose. Salah tightened his tie, glancing at her reflection. "You ready?" She looked back. Were we ever not? The gala was held in a modest hall overlooking Central Park. It wasn't glamorous. That wasn't the point. It was a gathering of people who cared about displaced, children about lost homes and second chances. But tonight there was a different energy. When they walked in, the room fell respectfully quiet. Not from celebrity awe, but from reverence. Every eye turned. People stood, not to clap but to honor. The host approached with warmth and sincerity. "Thank you for being here," she said to Maji. "You didn't have to come, not after all. But your presence means more than you know." Maji offered a small smile. "We came for the children, not for the noise." Later in the evening, Salah was asked to say a few words. He didn't prepare a speech. He didn't need to. He stood in front of a crowd that was already listening before he even spoke. "I didn't come here to talk about what happened at the airport," he began. "But I've come to understand that when things like that happen, publicly, painfully, staying silent doesn't help anyone." He looked toward Maji. My wife didn't deserve to be questioned, cornered, or stripped of dignity. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't resist. She just stood still, and that was seen as a threat. Why? Because she wore something that others didn't understand. The room was still. This isn't just about airports, it's about everyday life. Schools, streets, workplaces, where people who choose to live by their faith are made to explain themselves every day, to justify what should need no justification. He paused. We're not here to divide. We're here to ask for something simple, respect. That's it. No one's dignity should depend on whether a camera is watching. Applause wasn't instant. It came after a moment, the kind of applause that builds from the gut, from real emotion. Afterwards, guests came up quietly. A woman in a white headscarf said, "I've never heard anyone say what I've felt my whole life." A Catholic priest added, "Faith doesn't threaten society, it builds it." Even members of the staff, waiters and tech crew offered nods, signs of solidarity as they moved through the room. When Salah and Maji returned to the hotel, the world outside was no quieter. If anything, the story had gained new momentum. A former Premier League captain tweeted, "This is what leadership looks like. Not just goals, but grace." An academic launched a petition calling for mandatory training at UK airports to prevent cultural and religious bias. It crossed 100,000 signatures by midnight, and in Birmingham, a school hosted a Hijab Awareness Day, not for politics, but for compassion. A note from one of the students read, "Today I wore it, not for religion, but to understand someone else's walk." In that hotel room, Maji sat by the window reading the message. Her eyes were tired, but something in her had shifted. She turned to Salah. If one girl felt less alone today, maybe it was worth it. He nodded, and for the first time in days he smiled without effort. By the time Salah and Maji flew back to London, the world had already changed. Not in the way politicians promise, but in the way hearts sometimes open when they're forced to witness something raw, unfiltered, and painfully real. Their arrival at Heathrow was uneventful. No cameras, no crowds. Just a quiet immigration officer who scanned their passports, looked up for a split second, and offered the smallest of nods. Not in fanfare, but in recognition. Respect, finally given without. Demanded outside, the sky was the same as when they had left. Grey, tired, a bit too cold. But somehow it felt different now. Not lighter, just clearer. The airport had issued another statement that morning. This time, shorter. No fluffy language, no evasions, just a line that read, "We failed. We are listening. We will change." Whether they meant it or not, time would tell. But for now, Salah and Maji weren't interested in press releases. They were interested in peace. At home, things had shifted. His club had created a new initiative, not as a PR stunt, but something sincere. Training for staff on religious and cultural understanding. A message sent to every employee. If this can happen to her, it can happen to any of our fans. And we owe them better. Maji received letters, hundreds, some handwritten, some typed, some barely legible, sent from rural towns, inner-city flats, even prisons. Women, girls, fathers, strangers, people who had nothing in common except the way that one moment had made them feel something real. One envelope had no return address. Inside was a photo of a young woman in a hijab standing outside a school. On the back, written in thick black pen, it simply said, "Today, I didn't take it off." Another came from a grandmother in Devon. "I've lived through war and protests, but nothing ever made me cry like watching your wife stand there and say no. That wasn't just bravery. That was grace." Maji read each one slowly, carefully, like every word mattered, because it did. She didn't want fame. She didn't want a platform. She wanted the right to live with dignity. But now, whether she liked it or not, her silence had become a voice. Weeks passed. The noise faded, but not the impact. The story didn't vanish. It evolved. Newspapers began publishing essays, not just headlines. Young activists started campaigns. Teachers led classroom discussions about identity and respect. Even airport training manuals were quietly rewritten. But more than anything, It lived on in the ordinary, the small, quiet places no one filmed. A woman helping her daughter tie her scarf before school, telling her, "Hold your head high." A man on a train stopping a stranger from being harassed, saying, "Not today." A teenager in a town far from London walking through a shopping mall in a hijab for the first time, heart pounding, but she kept going. All of it. A ripple from that moment. One afternoon, Maji agreed to speak at a local school. Just a circle of girls, nothing grand, no reporters, just open faces and honest questions. One girl asked, "Were you scared when you stood there at the airport?" Maji paused. "Thoughtful?" "Yes," she said, "I was scared, but I wasn't alone. My husband stood with me. And so did many others, even strangers, and sometimes just knowing you're not alone is enough to make you strong." The girl nodded, and something in her posture changed, just a little straighter. Just a little. Braver. Back home that night, Maji sat beside Salah on the couch. He was watching old football clips, not his own, just classic matches, players he admired growing up. She smiled. "You're watching that again?" He grinned. Needed a reminder that not everything is heavy. She leaned her head on his shoulder. "You know, we never asked for this, but maybe it was meant to happen." Salah looked at her. If it gave someone courage, maybe it was. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This one from a girl in Indonesia. "I saw your story. I want to be like you, not famous, just strong." Maji typed a reply. Short, honest. You already are. The light in the room was soft. The world outside was as messy and unpredictable as ever. But inside that room, in that quiet moment, there was peace. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because a woman stood still, and the world was forced to move around her.